The World Trade Organization's Director-General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has warned the world powers against engaging in a subsidization race as they seek to generate investments in their green energy transitions. She gave the word of caution, though, during a panel discussion at the World Economic Forum being held at Davos in Switzerland.
During a discussion on a climate act introduced by US President Joe Biden's administration, the WTO Director-General shared her hopes that factors driving global green energy transition wouldn't be monopolized by developed nations through the provision of incentives that would disadvantage developing nations.
The balance that you talked about, what one does not want is, if we are going back to industrial policy, quote unquote, we should not see a race, a subsidization race. If it's a race, then you know that, of course, emerging markets and developing countries will not be able to compete in such a subsidy race. So I'm hoping that what we're seeing is going to be a balanced and nuanced approach to decarbonizing and not something else. We've seen the vulnerability of supply chains during the pandemic, the war in Ukraine. So we have to admit that the concentration of manufacturing or concentration of raw materials in very few countries is a problem that we need to deal with. We need to build resilience and diversify. So for me, that's not the issue is how. How do we do this? And I think the question of building resilience, we should have a broader mind frame.
The EU has also announced its own plans to facilitate green industry, including the mobilization of state aid and a sovereignty fund to keep firms in Europe.
And I know that in Europe, some people are criticizing IRA. And there are elements where we should talk. We should talk on certain elements which might look a bit unfair. But on a global scheme, we can only be happy with IRA, because finally, the #1 economic powerhouse in the world says decarbonizing is part of our trade agenda. So welcome on our side. Let's work together and let's see how we can make this, work. Well, I think the response should be our own scheme. We should make our own scheme, and it should not be copying what IRA is doing. I mean, we have our own advantages, and we should play on our own advantages. If you look at the technological side, in hydrogen, in offshore wind, and so on, actually Europe is leading in these domains compared to the United States, because we've invested in them much earlier. So we should come with our own scheme, which is more tailored to what our strengths are, and I don't think it's actually complementary to what the United States is doing.
Germany's economy minister has also said that gas storages stood at 90% in January, with increased capacity built in commendable time. He said the maintenance of a low gas price was key to managing and reducing the recession that's threatening Europe and Germany.
Well, for a perspective on the climate change deliberations at Davos, we're now joined by James Rieler, who is the Senior Manager for Climate Action with WWF South Africa. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Peter. I'm glad to be here.
So how high on the agenda is climate change at a gathering like WEF?
It's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, foremost in economic considerations at the moment is the cost of living crisis, and the Ukrainian political crisis has driven this energy issues across the globe, and so those sorts of things are really affecting the economy. But even given that, the WEF's sort of annual risk report, which is a comprehensive assessment of the risks to the economy, puts climate change and environmental issues very high. So over the next 2 years, of the sort of 10 highest risk items, 5 of those are environmental, and that includes natural disasters from extreme weather and failure to mitigate climate change. So for all that we're in this kind of new world over the last few years, post-COVID and after the Ukraine, it's still gaining traction and very much front of mind for a lot of the attendees at Davos.
All right, so in that sphere, what do you think is going to actually be discussed?
I mean, I think you got a flavor of it with that sort of little WTO clip there. But I think the reality is that a lot of the governments there and a lot of the companies are really trying to get a flavor and a sense of how the kind of transformation, this energy transformation that we're talking about to address climate mitigation is likely to roll out, and how to really leverage kind of the private sector investment into that alongside the public sector investment. So, you know, South Africa has this Just Energy Transition Partnership announced, and Indonesia similarly over at COP last year had it. So those are there are some packages for the coal heavy users globally, but there's still a lot of room for investment by the private sector, a huge amount. We're talking transformational activities. And I think you're seeing, you know, there's an engagement with that reality alongside the geopolitical concerns, the immediate concerns of the kind of inflationary environment that we're sitting in. And we're seeing a lot of active sort of advocacy from civil society outside, just making sure that they stay on message, if you like.
Yeah. Unlike things like COP15 in Canada and China, COP27 in Egypt, there isn't a resolution at the end of it from a gathering like WEF. So does that mean not much will be agreed, more conversations that perhaps can carry on elsewhere?
I think you're probably right. So Davos is primarily a place where you go to make connections, I think, and where you go to discuss kind of what you're seeing as the key issues and to try and broker some of those deals if you're a major economic player. And it's become a big issue over the last decade, where we're seeing many more heads of state going there, because there is also the potential for leveraging or at least initiating some of these public-private sector deals, right? There are the investment banks there are a lot of the kind of major mineral resource producers. And I think getting those people in the room and having a conversation is in itself a very important outcome. A lot of the groundwork for multilateral negotiations can be laid in these rooms. Although, as you say, we're not going to get some world-changing single agreement out of it. What you are likely to see is potentially some movement in some very critical areas and investors. And it is it is important that some of this happens in a slightly more public arena as opposed to just in behind closed doors, if you like. So in that regard, I do see it as probably not in the same light as the COPs, those big multilateral negotiations that you speak of, but certainly a very important complement to them.
It is a huge gathering, different interests from all over the world. How much voice and share of voice does the continent of Africa have, particularly when it comes to climate change and climate issues, just transition, mitigation, adaptation, all of those issues for the continent in particular? I mean,
if we're honest, probably not that much. One of the reasons that, some of the heads of state of African nations do go there is to try and get it onto the agenda. It's in the nature of an economic gathering like this that it's the economic powerhouses that make the plays, and that pretty much precludes a lot of us developing nations. But having said that, I do think that there is a kind of a big picture sentiment that is engaged at Davos, where we're really talking not just about the interests of a few players. They're trying to kind of keep the global economy intact, and that is very dependent on us doing a lot of the hard work adaptation, of mitigation, and of addressing the kind of environmental damage at an African level. So when the global risk assessment says that these are major concerns, and these are major concerns because they have economic impacts across the world, but they have economic impacts for insurers and those sorts of things. That means that they also need to then say, okay, well, when we're addressing them, and there is actually a space in which this can put pressure on governments to take action, that it can also drive some of the issues for developing nations. But I think the key elements we're talking about a just transition, and for a lot of the developing world, it's actually more of an energy transformation that we're talking about. It's not just how do we shift fossil fuel workers and coal workers to a new job that is also sufficient, a good job that provides the sort of just employment characteristics that are needed. We're actually talking about energy provision for folks that don't have it, all right? And that kind of transformational issue, I mean, there are definitely fora which are taking it forward in the meetings. I know there was a KPMG meeting today that WWF was speaking at, and UNDP was involved, really trying to focus on how do you operationalize some of the just energy transformation issues. And there's alliances built around that. But whether it's the kind of mainstream discussion of the meetings, I doubt that that's, we're at the forefront.
Okay, you've partly answered my last question, actually, is what do you want to communicate there, WWF, South Africa, and bodies like yours?
I mean, for us, we've got to remember that the departure point for the economy, an economy is really just a vehicle that's supposed to serve human welfare, and it's within this global paradigm. It's dependent on natural resources and the environment, and so if we're not taking those adequately into consideration, then we undermine the whole sort of process of provision of economic wealth, but of human welfare well beyond the economy. And so, we're really hoping to see much more advocacy and much stronger commitment to a transformation in how we do essentially not just energy, which is definitely for South Africa a critical issue, but also for all of Europe have been facing this energy crisis. But actually, a lot of the systems that drive the economy. We need to be much smarter about circular economy and reusing resources. And this potentially is a forum where some of that can really be articulated and mapped out. So that's really what we're hoping to see, is much more of that in the agenda.
James Reeder, we're going to have to leave it there. I think it was about a year ago, the last time I spoke to you. We have to do it a little bit more often this year. But thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Very good to speak with you.
Great. All right, that's James Reeder, who's a Senior Manager for Climate Action at WWF South Africa at Davos in Switzerland, presenting a case, I think, for climate change not to be just one of those subjects that's talked about but not done about going forward.